This is Dr. Panda.
Someone said that beer came first and then civilization followed. Is this statement correct? So, how was beer born? Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Panda, and next, I'll be focusing on beer. The origin of beer. The earliest origin of beer can be traced back to Western Asia, around 8000 BCE during the Sumerian civilization. Some argue that the brewing process of beer emerged from the development of human agriculture, while others believe that the discovery of fermentation was what prompted ancient people to settle and start farming. The most basic ingredients of beer are water, malt, yeast, and hops. Water is abundant and easily accessible. Yeast naturally exists in the air and couldn't be cultivated by people at the time. Hops were only introduced thousands of years later, and malt was the defining ingredient in early beer brewing. In fact, beer began to accompany humanity from the very moment people discovered and understood barley. They cultivated barley and made it a primary staple in their daily diet. It didn't take long for them to notice that if barley was moistened, allowed to sprout for a while, and then quickly dried, it became sweeter, more nutritious, and less prone to spoilage. This discovery likely came about when a careless person left barley outside, and it got wet from the rain. Too reluctant to discard it, they found it unexpectedly sweet, and thus malt, one of beer's most crucial ingredients, was born. We should thank that careless soul. Later, another absent-minded individual probably left bread or malt in water, where the dissolved sugars became the perfect feast for airborne yeast. That's how the first cup of beer came to be. We owe a huge thanks to the brave soul who first dared to taste that strange, bubbly concoction fermented after being drenched by rain. Of course, the story of beer's accidental discovery might have other versions. For instance, some scholars believe that the first time humans drank beer was purely by chance. One scholar said, "During a gathering expedition, people placed the barley they collected into some kind of container and then went off to hunt. During this time, a natural miracle occurred. First, it rained, and the rainwater soaked the barley, causing it to sprout. As it sprouted, the barley produced sugar, and then it needed more water. Fortunately, it rained again, and this time, the ample rainwater filled the entire container. Then, a miracle happened. Wild yeast converted the sugar produced by the barley into carbon dioxide and alcohol. A few days later, the hunters returned, looked into the container, and discovered this bubbling mixture. Someone took a risk, tasted it, and thought, this stuff is really something special. That's how humans accidentally stumbled upon beer. Our ancestors began to find this taste enjoyable. After several accidental instances of producing beer, the clever ones thought, we can figure out this process just like we did with growing barley. The oldest known written record of an alcoholic beverage is from around 6000 BCE, when the Babylonians carved a recipe for sacrificial beer into clay tablets. This drink quickly became an essential part of Mesopotamian civilization, partly due to its connection with religion. To the people of that time, this beverage was mysterious, a gift from the gods. They didn't know about alcohol, let alone yeast. This magical drink helped them feel closer to the divine, as if they were ascending to the heavens. Well, yes, because they were getting drunk. Due to its use in religious practices, beer quickly gained popularity in regions like Egypt, the Aztec Empire, and the Inca Empire. At that time, production conditions meant all beer had to be brewed by hand, and people could freely add various crops to the mix, resulting in a dazzling array of beers. During ancient Babylonian times, more than 20 types of beer could be produced, a tradition that continued until the advent of industrial beer. Around 1780 BCE, the ancient Babylonians were the first to transport beer to other regions. One of their cellar-aged beers was particularly loved by the ancient Egyptians, who lived 1,000 kilometers away. Subsequently, the Egyptians took ancient beer to new heights, cultivating grains specifically for brewing and building on Babylonian discoveries to master the technique of sprouting grains by leaving water exposed to the air. In ancient Egypt, due to limited productivity, simply having enough food to eat was a blessing, and beer became one of the most important sources of nutrition. The pharaohs, who believed in the existence of gods, were obsessed with building eternal pleasures for their afterlife, pyramids. The state conscripted countless laborers to construct these pyramids, compensating them with bread and beer. This attracted many of the struggling masses of society at the time. No more worrying about feeding the family. The reward system back then was quite flexible. If you couldn't finish your beer in a day, you could claim it a couple of days later, and the state would issue you a beer IOU. This might just be the world's earliest debit system. Thus, fueled by beer, pyramids rose from the ground one after another. It's fair to say that without beer, there might not have been pyramids. From the Roman era to the Middle Ages, wine experienced a golden age of development. During this time, beer was seen as a trendy beverage befitting the nobility. The ruling class, holding sway over society's narrative, gradually pushed beer out of the mainstream, relegating it to a less popular drink. Beer's development slowed during this period, but with the rise of industrial economies, regionally distinctive beer varieties began to emerge once more. The great development of modern beer. After the rise of Christianity, beer experienced tremendous development, largely thanks to the influence of monks. Monastery beer began to take the stage in history, with the most famous examples coming from Belgium. Belgium is an interesting country, small in size but with a significant impact on modern world history. For instance, in the beer industry, 4 or 5 of the top 10 craft beers in the world today still originate from Belgium. In the centuries following the Renaissance, as the power struggle between the church and secular authorities weakened theocracy, monasteries had to find ways to sustain themselves. In 1664, a monastery in France decided that the fasting days were too harsh on the monks and relaxed the rules, allowing them to drink beer instead of eating food to sustain themselves. After all, it's made from barley. However, the beer had to be brewed by the monks themselves, as they were required to earn their sustenance through their own labor. This practice later spread across Europe. In fact, due to rapid industrial development and a sharp population increase at the time, water sources became polluted. Europeans, unaccustomed to drinking boiled water, paid a heavy price for it, with rampant infectious diseases. Beer, which required boiling during its brewing process, became a safe beverage in that era. Monasteries, needing to survive and earn money through their own efforts, found selling beer to be a good solution. Even today, Belgian monastery beer remains notably expensive. Of course, in the development of beer, there's a great contributor we must mention: hops, beer's natural preservative. In the early days of beer brewing, hops were not used. Beer would easily turn sour into vinegar, a problem that plagued brewers for centuries. The brothers Grimm, in their 1877 German dictionary, wrote helplessly about hops. It is impossible to accurately determine when hops were first used in brewing. A more accepted theory is that brewers experimentally added various wild herbs to the brewing process to extend the beer's shelf life, and only wild hops stood out and began to be used in beer making. Later, around the 7th century AD, with the development and increased demand for beer brewing, wild hops gradually could not meet the process requirements. So, just as humans domesticated other crops, people began the artificial cultivation of hops. Therefore, hops were not initially chosen by brewers for their unique aroma. People valued their anti-spoilage properties. It must be said that this is another beautiful coincidence in the history of beer development. People discovered that hops could change the taste of beer, making it smoother, and as a natural preservative, greatly extend its shelf life, allowing low-alcohol beers to be preserved and reach the international market. It can be said that without hops, there would be no flourishing beer culture today. The development of beer is closely related to human activities. India Pale Ale, IPA, is a very famous style in craft beer. Its country of origin is England, and it was beer consumed by early British people in India. So why did Britain develop an Indian market? Here, we need to mention the glorious history of the British Empire. From the late 18th to the 19th century, British colonial expansion reached its peak, occupying a quarter of the world's land area, known as the empire on which the sun never sets, and this included India. During the colonial period, Britain stationed a large army in India. Because the British felt that the sanitation in India was poor, Some merchants decided to ship beer from Britain to India by ocean-going freighters to provide them with a safe beverage. However, due to the long journey, traditional British beer quickly spoiled. Their solution was to add a large amount of hops to the beer to extend its shelf life, and this new type of beer, full of robust bitterness, came into being and flourished in the hands of Americans. Speaking of beer, how can we not mention the United States, which truly globalized beer? After the rise of the United States, its strong industrial capacity made mass production of beer possible. American innovation and industrial agricultural capabilities enabled it to establish its own system in beer, with bolder beer styles, daring to try various ingredients, creating beers different from those in Europe, and ultimately globalizing beer. Fashionable craft beer. As eras evolve, human desires ebb and flow like tides. Since the modern era, people have grown dissatisfied with the uniform beer produced by factory assembly lines. The joy of personally crafting brews through home brewing has quietly become an indispensable soul of craft beer consumption. Consequently, home brewing has gradually seeped into the cracks of everyday life like an undercurrent. The wheels of history often turn in strikingly similar ways across different fields. Design strips away extravagance to return to purity. Fashion finds solace in retro styles, and so it is with beer. After the wave of industrialization swept through brewing processes, people began to tire of the coldness of machinery and instead sought out dietary habits that combined health and pleasure. Thus, beer brewing ceased to be mere production and became a pilgrimage back to handcraft, a tribute to authenticity. Today, craft beer is blossoming with unprecedented brilliance in Europe and the United States. In the American market, the annual consumption of craft beer has quietly surpassed that of industrial beer, becoming the most favored type of alcoholic beverage. This is not just a victory for taste buds, but also a response to the depths of human nature. In the torrent of standardization and efficiency, people ultimately choose to brew their own stories with their own hands, savoring the freedom and warmth of life in every sip of foam. And that's a wrap for this episode of the video. I'm DR.RED Panda. If any of you have your own perspectives, or if you think there are any errors in the video, feel free to leave a comment in the discussion section. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Until next time, take care.